The topic of today's lecture is the lymphatic system. Now, the lymphatic system has two key roles in our body. The first role of the lymphatic system is to drain excess tissue fluid, and illustrated here on this image are a range of lymphatic vessels that are found throughout the body. These are the larger lymphatic vessels and ducts, and as you can see, they're extensively distributed throughout the body. The other key role of the lymphatic system is to provide protection from disease-causing microorganisms. So this is our first slide where we're going to discuss the basic features, the basic structural elements, and the basic functions of the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system consists of lymphatic vessels, capillaries, trunks, and ducts that we'll talk about soon. It also consists of lymph nodes and a variety of lymphoid organs such as the spleen. A key role of the lymphatic system is to remove excess tissue fluid from the tissues. This is a very important function. In particular, fluid that has leaked out of capillaries of the cardiovascular system must be recovered and returned to the cardiovascular system to maintain fluid homeostasis. And the lymphatic system is fundamentally involved in maintaining that fluid homeostasis. Another key role of the lymphatic vessels is to recover fat from the small intestine. The next major function of the lymphatic system is to provide protection from foreign materials, in particular infectious microorganisms. The first issue I'll talk about is the function of the lymphatic system in fluid recovery. Now, as I mentioned before, the cardiovascular system, fluid will leak out from that because the fluid in the cardiovascular system is under pressure. So in the capillaries of the cardiovascular system, fluid will seep out into the surrounding tissue spaces. And that's why we have this photograph here. This is indicating fluid under pressure escaping from the system. So this is similar to what is happening in the cardiovascular system. Blood under pressure, and in the capillaries, some of the fluid in that blood will seep out. Up to 2 to 4 litres a day will seep out of the capillaries of the cardiovascular system, and this must be returned to the bloodstream to maintain fluid homeostasis. Once the fluid is in the tissue, we refer to it as interstitial fluid. Now, to recover this tissue fluid, we have a system of vessels, lymphatic vessels. They form a one-way network to drain this lymphatic fluid back to the cardiovascular system. Once the fluid enters the lymphatic vessels, we refer to it as lymph. So the interstitial fluid, when it enters the vessels of the lymphatic system, is now called lymph. And that's what this photograph is representing here. It's drainage, and that's a key role of the lymphatic vessels. The overall aim of this process is to maintain fluid homeostasis. This diagram here is an effective summary of both the structure and the function of the lymphatic system. Notice firstly this part of the diagram. This is representing the cardiovascular system, the heart, the arteries, capillaries, and the veins. A closed loop, so fluid will circulate through this system. The heart provides the pumping pressure to move the blood through this system. However, a problem with this pressure that the blood is under is that it will cause a certain amount of the fluid in the capillary beds to seep out into the surrounding tissue spaces where it becomes interstitial fluid. So we have this fluid leaking out of the cardiovascular system. Now, this fluid must be returned back to the cardiovascular system. So what we have within the tissues are a system of other vessels referred to as lymphatic vessels, and that's what we can see here. The smallest of these are the lymphatic capillaries. These are the ones where the fluid will enter, and we can see here some blue lines. This is indicating interstitial fluid entering the lymphatic capillaries. The lymphatic fluid, once it's inside here, we refer to as lymph, and it will flow through this system of vessels. Notice the one-way valves. That assists the flow of fluid back towards the cardiovascular system. At various points along the vessels, you will also encounter these structures. This is a lymph node. It's very important because what it does is it will examine the lymphatic fluid, and if there are pathogens within it, the pathogens will be identified, and then an immune response will be activated against them, and hopefully those pathogens will be eliminated. This is showing you some pathogens over here which are entering the system. The pathogens might be some sort of parasitic organism, it might be a type of bacteria, or some other sort of infectious system. So the lymphatic vessels are very important for draining tissue fluid and also for purifying and disinfecting the fluid that is recovered. Lymphatic vessels are found widely throughout the body. They drain pretty much all of the tissues and organs except a few as indicated here. The brain and spinal cord, cornea, epidermis, bone marrow and cartilage do not have drainage facilitated by lymphatic vessels. As the lymphatic capillaries progress and recover the fluid, eventually they will converge with one another and form larger lymphatic vessels. So what I'll do first is indicate here an anterior view, and what we can see is an extensive network of lymphatic vessels in the anterior presentation. Notice how they tend to converge in certain regions of the body, such as here in the axillary region under the arm, or the inguinal region here. There are convergence of these vessels to these areas. Notice also these spherical structures. These are lymph nodes where the lymphatic fluid will be purified and disinfected. If we take a posterior view, we can also see the extensive networking of the lymphatic vessels. So the key thing about those two images that I've just shown you there is to remind you of how widely distributed the lymphatic vessels are throughout the body, and in all locations they will be critical to the drainage of tissue fluid. In this slide we'll start talking about how the fluid is recovered by the lymphatic vessels. Recovery of the fluid occurs in the smallest of the vessels, the capillaries. Now the capillaries are blind-ended. They're not part of a closed loop. They're kind of like a dead end. The cells in lymphatic capillaries are squamous epithelial cells we've referred to as endothelial cells. So superficially they bear a resemblance to those of the cardiovascular capillaries. However, they differ from the cardiovascular capillaries in that the cells overlap each other much more loosely. They tend to form one-way valves. It allows fluid to enter the capillary but not exit, and then the fluid is directed back towards the cardiovascular system, and that is assisted by the presence of one-way valves. Within the small intestine there are a class of lymphatic capillaries that are referred to as lacteals that are very important for lipid absorption. This slide here is a good slide to highlight the structural and functional relationships of capillaries of the cardiovascular system with those of the lymphatic system. Here we have the cardiovascular vessels, a vein, capillary bed and an artery, and the blood will flow in via the artery into the capillary bed and out via the vein. It's in this region here, the capillary bed, where the fluid in the blood under pressure will seep out into the tissue spaces. There it becomes interstitial fluid. That interstitial fluid must be recovered to maintain fluid homeostasis. So what we have here is this network of lymphatic capillaries, and fluid that's in the tissue spaces will enter the lymphatic capillaries and be directed and channeled back towards the cardiovascular system. Over here we have focus on a particular region of the lymphatic capillary, the ends of one of them, and we've magnified that to see some of the structural features of the lymphatic capillary in more detail. Notice how it's not part of a closed loop as the cardiovascular capillaries are. It's a dead end. Notice the cells of the capillary, loosely overlapping squamous epithelial cells or endothelial cells. These fine filaments here anchor to the surrounding tissue, and the structure formed is like a one-way valve. Interstitial fluid may enter the lymphatic vessel but not exit. Once inside, it will be channeled by a system of one-way valves back towards the cardiovascular system. The animation here helps to highlight the function of these loosely overlapping endothelial cells. There they are there, the blue cells there. The interstitial fluid under pressure enters the vessel, and it is then channeled via a one-way system of valves, eventually back to the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic capillaries are the smallest of the lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic capillaries are very numerous. As they are recovering the tissue fluid from the tissues, they will eventually converge with one another to form larger lymphatic trunks. And we will look at a few of these in this unit. Lymphatic trunks are typically named according to their location or the areas of the body that they drain. And here's just a few good examples of lymphatic trunks. There are a couple of lumbar trunks, a right and left one. They drain lymphatic fluid from the lower limbs, lower abdominal wall, and the pelvic organs. Intestinal trunk, as the name suggests, drains the organs of the abdominal cavity, such as the intestines. Subclavian trunks recover lymph from the upper limbs. Jugular trunks, they recover lymph from regions of the head and neck. These trunks, in turn, will eventually converge with one another and form what we call ducts. These are the largest of the lymphatic vessels. There are two of them, the thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct. Now this image over here is simply to highlight the concept of convergence of vessels. Microscopic lymphatic capillaries will converge with one another to form larger lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels in turn converge with one another to form the large lymphatic ducts. This is showing you a model of the lymphatic vessels that we've just spoken about. Notice the region here we're looking at, the abdominal region of this model. The white lines on this model are representing the lymphatic vessels. Notice how extensively distributed they are, and these are just the ones you can see without the aid of magnification. In this region here, the abdominal region, we have a point of convergence of three of the large lymphatic trunks. Right and left lumbar trunk are indicated here, and the intestinal trunk here, they have a point of convergence. Superior to that, we have this dilated structure we call the cisterna chyli, and immediately above that we can see the thoracic duct has been indicated. So this thoracic duct will return the majority of lymph that's picked up in the body back to the cardiovascular system. So this is just an interesting landmark we'll get you to focus on in the practical. The cisterna chyli, which marks the point of convergence of the right and left lumbar trunks, and the intestinal trunk. The largest of the lymphatic vessels are the lymphatic ducts, and we've got two of these, a right lymphatic duct and a thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct drains lymph from the right arm, right side of the head and thorax, so essentially the right upper quadrant of the body. The other major duct is the thoracic one. That is the one that is indicated by the arrow here. So there you have the model. There's the thoracic duct, which is indicated. This is quite a large duct, very easy to see. This drains lymphatic fluid from the rest of the body. So the left upper quadrant and all of the lower body, the lymphatic fluid from those regions will be drained back to the cardiovascular system by the thoracic duct. As we saw in the previous slide, we can see this vessel as originating from a dilated region which is found anterior to lumbar vertebra number 2, a region we call the cisterna chyli. That was the point where the lumbar trunks, right and left one, and also the intestinal trunks converged. What will happen is lymphatic fluid in the thoracic duct will be returned eventually up here at a point where the internal jugular and subclavian veins fuse together. That is the point where the thoracic duct empties the lymph back into the system, the cardiovascular system. Similar thing happens on the other side of the body, which we'll talk about now. This is showing you the drainage patterns for the major lymphatic ducts. On this side, we have the region of the body that is drained by the right lymphatic duct. So it's really the right upper quadrant, right side of the head, thorax, and the right upper limb. All the rest of the body, the lymphatic fluid from these regions is recovered via the thoracic duct. And over here we have a cadaver where the organs of the thorax have been removed to reveal the thoracic duct. We can see it running parallel to the thoracic aorta there. It will travel superiorly and eventually it will loop back over and converge at this point here, where we have the left internal jugular vein and the left subclavian vein converging. The right lymphatic duct empties lymphatic fluid over this side, where the right subclavian vein and the right internal jugular vein converge. And this slide is just using the model that you'll see in the practice to highlight the points at which these large lymphatic ducts return the lymphatic fluid back to the cardiovascular system. On both sides of the body, the lymphatic fluid is recovered back to the cardiovascular system, where the internal jugular and subclavian veins meet. Now, it's important to note that we are recovering this lymphatic fluid back into veins and not arteries, because the pressure inside the veins is much lower than the pressure inside the arteries. So it's much easier to return this lymphatic fluid back into a vein than into a high pressure artery. Now, it's important to emphasize here that drainage of this excess tissue fluid is very important for the body's ability to maintain fluid homeostasis. Without this drainage capacity, you can encounter major problems. And a good example of this is what happens in this disease, lymphatic filariasis. It's a disease of the lymphatic system which is caused by a microscopic parasitic worm. There are a number of species that cause this disease. Here's one of them shown here. It's a microscopic worm. We can see white blood cells here. That gives us a sense of scale. Carried by mosquitoes and infects people primarily in the tropics. Symptoms of filariasis include inflammation of the lymphatic system, and you get a high count of eosinophils, which is a particular class of white blood cells. However, what's particularly interesting is that in this disease you often get edema as a consequence of blockages caused by these worms in the lymphatic vessels. So fluid will start to accumulate because the recovery of tissue fluid is being impeded. In extreme cases, this can be evident as a condition we call elephantiasis. And I'll just briefly show you a few images of that condition. I'll show in particular how it can grossly distort structures of the body. So this video here is showing a sufferer of lymphatic filariasis where the condition has progressed to elephantiasis. So that condition was caused by the presence of this parasitic worm blocking the drainage of tissue fluid. The next thing I'll talk about in this lecture is the role of the lymphatic system in protecting you from disease, what we call immunity. As the lymphatic vessels recover the interstitial fluid, they also take the opportunity to send them to lymph nodes and other lymphoid organs, where the lymph can be inspected for the presence of infectious microorganisms. In the structures such as the lymph node, the lymph can be purified and disinfected, and immune responses can be activated against potential pathogens. So what I'll do now is start talking about this role of the lymphatic system in immunity. I'll talk about lymph nodes, lymphoid cells, and also other lymphatic organs such as the spleen and their roles in the immune system. Within many of the lymphatic structures, such as the lymph nodes and the lymphoid organs, you will find specialized types of cells we call lymphoid cells. They are primarily variations of leukocytes, which are white blood cells. So white blood cells or leukocytes are found in the cardiovascular system, but they are also found in great abundance in the lymphatic structures. And there they play key roles in maintaining your resistance to disease. Two main types of lymphoid cells that we'll mention are the lymphocytes. These take on a variety of roles in fending off disease. They can do things like produce antibodies, attack pathogens or infected cells directly, or modulate a range of immune responses. The two main types of lymphocytes that you'll hear mentioned are the T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. The other lymphoid cells worth mentioning are the lymphoid macrophages and dendritic cells. These will identify and phagocytize or engulf foreign materials, and they also interact with other cells of the immune system to modulate immune responses. What I'll do now is just show you a quick animation. It's a time lapse of one of these lymphoid cells identifying and attacking pathogens. You'll see a cell racing round after a little small bacterial particle. So there we go, there's the lymphoid cell, and there is the bacteria which it's chasing, and eventually it'll catch it up and engulf it. There we go, it's grabbed the bacteria and engulfed it. We'll go through that again. At this point, there we go, chasing the bacteria, and eventually there we go, it's caught it and engulfed it and will hopefully destroy it. One of the key areas where the purification of the lymph occurs is in lymph nodes. These are discrete, capsule-covered structures which are found widely along the lymphatic vessels. They tend to be bean-shaped as a consequence of this indentation here at the hilum. Vary in size from 1 to up to 25 millimeters long. They get larger during cases of infection, and many are clustered in groups in certain regions of the body. So you get these regional clusters of lymph nodes. And we'll just mention a couple of these as we're going through. Key functions of these lymph nodes: purification and disinfection of the fluid that's flowing through. And if something is picked up, then you have a chance to activate the rest of the immune system against that pathogen. As I mentioned before, you will typically find lymph nodes clustered in specific regions of the body. These areas tend to be where there's convergence of many of the lymphatic vessels. So in the inguinal region, the axillary region, you'll often see lymphatic vessels converging on those areas. So where this convergence is occurring, we cluster together lots of lymph nodes and look at the lymph as it's flowing through and purify and disinfect it. Here's an example where the cervical lymph nodes, some of them are responding to an infection, and you've got this swelling occurring, and that's typical of where there's an infection occurring and the lymph nodes are activating an immune response against it. In the next few slides, I'll just briefly mention some of the regional clusters of lymph nodes. One of the most obvious ones are the inguinal lymph nodes. These are located in the inguinal region. Typically you'll get them clustered together here, where you get, say, from 10 to 20 lymph nodes all clustered together. And what is happening is lymph is being recovered from the lower limbs, the genitals and the gluteal region, and as it passes through, it's inspected in these regional clusters. Another good example of a regional lymph node cluster is the mesenteric or intestinal lymph nodes. You can see those here in clusters. And what will happen is the vessels here will be draining fluid from the intestines, and as it does that, as the fluid flows through those vessels, it passes through these clusters of lymph nodes. You'll notice in particular the lymph nodes tend to parallel the mesenteric artery up here. Another good example of a regional cluster of lymph nodes are the axillary lymph nodes, located in the axilla under the arm here. Fluid here will be draining from the upper limbs, the posterior neck muscles and the majority of the breast. And as the fluid converges in this region here, it's inspected by the axillary lymph nodes. The last cluster I'll mention are the cervical lymph nodes, which we can see in the cervical region, and as fluid from the head and neck is passing through, it is inspected by this cluster of lymph nodes. Now, you should get more information about this in the practicals, and you can study the actual clusters in more detail. This is just to give you an overview that a regional cluster of lymph nodes will be found where the vessels are converging at a particular point, and the cluster is named according to the region where it is found. In this next section, I'll focus on the structure of a specific lymph node. So we've talked about clusters of lymph nodes. Now we'll have a look at the basic structure of a lymph node. It's a capsule-covered organ. There's dense, regular connective tissue holding it together. Extensions of the capsule extend inwards. They are what we call trabeculae. They form essentially an internal skeleton and also help partition the lymph node into specific regions where structures such as the follicles can be found. You have a cortex in a lymph node, which is the outer region, and an inner medulla. In the cortex, the trabeculae form these divisions, and in these sort of partitions you find structures we refer to as lymphatic follicles. There you will have dense collections of lymphoid cells, things like the lymphocytes and the dendritic cells. All of those cells will be involved in helping to screen and purify the lymph. In some cases you will notice that these follicles have a pale centre. If you see that, it's often referred to as a germinal centre and tends to indicate that the lymph node is reacting to some sort of infectious microorganism, that an immune response is being activated. The germinal centres contain many proliferating B lymphocytes. In the medulla, there are no follicles. Instead, what we have there are these cords, cord-like structures, once again packed with lots of lymphocytes and other cells such as macrophages. Whether you're in this area here, the cortex with the follicles, or in the medulla with the cords, the key role of the cells there is to purify and disinfect the fluid that is flowing through. The lymph fluid enters the lymph node by any one of these afferent lymphatic vessels. If you want to know the direction of the fluid flow, look at how the valves are pointing. So the fluid is flowing in via this way to the afferent lymphatic vessels. It'll flow through the cortex into the medulla and then out via the efferent lymphatic vessel. Channels where the fluid flows are called sinuses. So there's an example of a sinus there. So the white material there is a sinus. It's just a wide channel where some of the fluid can flow through. Once the fluid has passed through the lymph node, it exits via the efferent lymphatic vessel here, and this region here, this indented region, is the hilum. This is just showing you an actual image of a real lymph node that has been sectioned. It's what we call a histology slide. We can see the basic lymph node structure, the outer cortex, the inner medulla, and in the outer cortex, these spherical structures, these follicles, are very visible. Very easy to see. This is relatively low power magnification. So let's just see if we can highlight those. There are the follicles there. Occasionally you can see areas where in the freshly sectioned lymph node you might notice they're a bit paler, and if you see that, that is referred to as a germinal centre, and that's where there are proliferating B lymphocytes. So the fluid will flow past the follicles into the medulla, and in the medulla you have the medullary cords. The fluid will then exit via the efferent lymphatic vessel. This is showing you a much higher power view of the tissue structure of a lymph node. Now the main concept to get here is that you have this fine network of reticular fibres. Reticular fibres are like a type of fine collagen. They provide this cobweb-like matrix within the lymph node, or the other lymphoid organs also have this too. Embedded within that reticular network are lymphoid cells, things like lymphocytes, macrophages, and what will happen is the fluid will flow through here, and if there's something that's of concern to the body, it can be identified and dealt with by the lymphoid cells here in the lymph node. So it looks a bit like a sieve in a way. So imagine this sieve, the sieve created from these reticular fibres with lots of lymphoid cells embedded on them, looking at the fluid, screening it and cleaning it up. So this just summarises some of the topics I was talking about previously, some of the structures found in a lymph node. You have a capsule. Extensions of the capsule called trabeculae extend inwards. They divide and support the node structures. You have a cortex, which is the outer superficial region, and a medulla, which is the inner region. Follicles are spherical structures found within the cortex, densely packed with lymphoid cells, and I mentioned briefly the germinal centres that are sometimes found in the centre of follicles, where there are proliferating B cells or B lymphocytes, as they're also called. Medullary cords are strands of the lymphoid cells found deeper into the node. Before we move to our next topics, I'll talk very briefly about a pathology of a lymph node. This is what we call lymphoma. It's a neoplasm or tumour of lymphatic tissue. Now, traditional classification systems for these diseases have divided lymphomas into two main groups. That's Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now that system is somewhat out of date, and there's a more complex system that exists now, but we'll just follow this more traditional classification system for the moment. This is an example of a Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a common cancer in young adults. So here we have a lymph node which has been removed, which has the tumour in it. And here we have an individual where the growth of the tumour is now evident as an enlargement in the cervical region. So one of the cervical lymph nodes, the tumour is present and it's enlarged. The tumour is derived from lymphocytes, and fortunately there are good outcomes for this condition with early detection and treatment. In the final section of this presentation, we'll consider the major lymphoid organs. So let's refresh our memories for a minute. We started off with lymphatic vessels, we've then looked at lymphoid cells, and now we've gone and just finished talking about lymph nodes. The final topic is the lymphoid organs. They are indicated here. We'll look quickly at the tonsils, thymus, spleen, Peyer's patches and appendix. Whichever organ you are looking at, remember the primary role is that these organs will play some role in fending off disease. So immunity is the key function of all of these organs. The largest lymphoid organ of the body is the spleen. It's located dorsal and lateral to the stomach and inferior to the thoracic diaphragm. There is a hilum in it, which is an indentation that's penetrated by the splenic artery, the vein, and lymphatic vessels. This structure has a number of roles. It plays a key role in immune surveillance. It also produces blood in the fetus. It can transfer plasma from blood to lymphatic vessels as well to help maintain fluid volume. And it can also remove damaged red blood cells. That's one of its key functions. So here we have this old red blood cell, an erythrocyte, and here we have a macrophage that's found in the spleen. It's now being engulfed and destroyed by the splenic macrophage. This image here shows the basic gross anatomy of the spleen. You can see this indentation here, the hilum, where the splenic artery and vein enter. We can see it adjacent here to the thoracic diaphragm, and the part of the spleen that's adjacent to the thoracic diaphragm is referred to as the diaphragmatic surface, whereas the other surface is the visceral surface. Now, just a quick word of warning, a lot of new students of anatomy often confuse the spleen with the kidneys. However, they are quite different. Another organ of the lymphatic system is the thymus. It's a bilobe structure located in superior mediastinum, found between the sternum and the aortic arch. There it is indicated on the diagram over here. So here's your heart, and here sitting on top of it, the aortic arch is behind us, posterior to this image here. You have the bilobed thymus. Now this organ of the lymphatic system is particularly important during early life. It secretes hormones, these are thymosins, and they promote the maturation of a class of lymphocytes we call T lymphocytes. These lymphocytes are essential for your immune function. The thymus is most active during early life. However, from about the age of 14 onwards, this organ undergoes involution or shrinkage, and it becomes less and less significant. In elderly people, in fact, it's difficult to locate. At this point, other organs of the lymphatic system will be taking over the role of the thymus. This is showing the thymus in the newborn. So here we have it sitting just on top of the heart, and behind that would be the aortic arch. Either side laterally we've got the lungs. Let's see the thymus. There we go, in a newborn, a very large organ, very important for promoting maturation of T lymphocytes. In elderly people, it's much less evident. So in adults, and particularly as you become elderly, it shrinks, and in fact in an older person it may be very difficult to locate it. You'll just get some fibrous fatty tissue left behind. Probably the thing I'd mention at this point, there we go, let's highlight it, is that many students confuse the thymus with the thyroid. The thyroid gland here, anterior to the trachea, is an endocrine organ which has several roles. However, it's a distinctly different organ to the thymus. But because of their proximity and their superficial resemblance to each other, sometimes these two organs are confused. I'll briefly mention the last few lymphoid organs. The tonsils are the first. These are patches of lymphatic tissue located around the throat. So they guard the entrances to the respiratory system. There are a few of these palatine, lingual, and pharyngeal tonsils. Pharyngeal tonsils are also referred to as the adenoids. Now, if we look inside the tonsils, we will see structures that are not unlike the follicles that we see inside a lymph node. That is, there are clusters of lymphoid cells clustering together, lymphocytes, macrophages, and so on, which are there to pick up the presence of infectious microorganisms. Now, if you're going to create those sorts of structures, you should put them in the body in areas where pathogens are likely to enter. And the respiratory system is one of those areas of the body where pathogens can gain entry. There are deep invaginations of the epithelium associated with these structures where the bacteria can enter, and once they're trapped, then the lymphoid cells can gain access to them and potentially alert the body to the presence of these infectious agents. Here we have some quite enlarged palatine tonsils at the back of the mouth here, and there's this awful looking material here that's called tonsil cheese. It's believed to be a mixture of dried mucus, pus, and it smells quite unpleasant. The final structures associated with the lymphatic system I'll mention are those of the mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. These are clusters of lymphatic tissue found in the walls of the digestive and respiratory tracts. So as we saw with the tonsils, there are points of the body where pathogens can fairly easily gain access to the interior of the body. The respiratory system is one good example of that, as pathogens can come in through the airways. The digestive system is another one. When you ingest food, pathogens can potentially enter the body and infect you. So as we saw with the tonsils, we set up points in those body structures such as the respiratory system and digestive system. We set up points where there is lymphatic tissue that can screen for the presence of these infectious agents, and if they're present, they can be removed. Inside the small intestine, particularly in a region we call the ileum, there are clusters of lymphoid follicles that we call Pear's patches. The appendix is also part of the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. It's an offshoot of part of the large intestine we call the cecum. It has heavy concentration of the lymphoid follicles which contain the lymphoid cells. It has nothing to do with the digestive function. So, as we have with the tonsils, these mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue structures, such as the appendix and the Pear patches, provide protection from infection. And that concludes this lecture.